GRASP is the Great Ape Survival Partnership, and it's the only species conservation program within the United Nations. It's a unique alliance of member countries, supporting nations, research institutions, conservation organizations. Over 100 partners comprise GRASP. And it was started in 2001 with the mandate to really save the great apes from extinction. The fear was that it was imminent. We had to move quickly if we were going to keep them on this planet. I think it's morphed into something more than that now, where it is clearly that by saving great apes, in many ways, we're saving ourselves. They've become great indicators of the world we live in and the world we're creating for ourselves.
And just briefly, what do we mean by great apes?
Well, there's 4 species of great apes in the wild, and that would be chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos. They stretch right across equatorial Africa, and then orangutans are in Southeast Asia. Technically, human beings are also a great ape. We're the 5th great ape, really. But for the purposes of GRASP, we've only focused on the 4 that are in the forests.
And why should we be worried about the apes? What's the situation in terms of their numbers and sort of how sort of diversified they are in terms of regional locations?
Well, with 7 billion people on the Earth right now, and perhaps 9 billion in the foreseeable future, there's not a lot of space left. And it turns out that great apes need pretty much the same things we do to survive, the same areas, the same habitats, the same temperatures, the same food. We're in direct competition now with great apes. There's probably little doubt we'll win. But we also have the grace and the intelligence to not push them off the planet, I think. At this point, though, the numbers are not necessarily encouraging about great apes. All of their habitat is declining, their populations are primarily declining, and they're facing very real issues in terms of long-term survival. We're lucky that they are adaptable. Quite often they're able to live in forests that have been degraded or to move into areas that are not necessarily naturally their habitat, but that's probably not fair and perhaps not sustainable.
And give us an idea where they're based. So what parts of the world and what particular challenges are they facing? I mean, you'd have to go through every single part of the world, but in terms of the key parts of the world and those key challenges, give us an idea.
Sure. Well, in Asia, Southeast Asia, where the orangutans exist, only on 2 islands, Sumatra and Borneo. A total of about 55,000 orangutans survive in the wild right now. But those numbers are crashing very fast because much of Indonesia, which controls Borneo and Sumatra, and Malaysia, which also is part of Borneo, is converting its forests into oil palm plantations. It's a huge lucrative industry, high profits, low investment, quick turnaround, very hard to deny, but it comes at the cost of habitat that is so important. That's a consumer choice that we, as consumers around the world, have chosen to purchase products with palm oil in them, and it's coming at the cost of orangutans. In Africa, however, it's a very different issue. There it's really human encroachment and also extraction of timber, mining. Many of the sort of minerals and resources coming out of Africa are being pulled from areas that are great ape habitat. And great apes, unfortunately, are losing that battle with us. Another thing that's becoming quite apparent is they're susceptible to every single disease practically that we can carry. So that if there's so little space now between human beings and gorillas, you're finding that Ebola, anthrax, Marburg virus, just simple flu can wipe out populations of great apes very quickly, and there are not a lot. In Cameroon and Nigeria, for instance, the most critically endangered great ape is the Cross River gorilla. Perhaps less than 300 exist. And is that a viable number, 300? I don't know.
I met a fascinating chap from Cameroon on my bus journey in yesterday. We had a long conversation in broken French about the role of protecting rainforests and also the attitude that locals have to apes and bushmeat, I guess you'd call it. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because he said, from what I could gather, he said, well, look, this is their supermarket. Who are you to come in and say, stop eating? So he said, before you tell them to stop, give them an alternative.
I can agree with that premise in theory. And I think much of the West, or the developed nations, however you want to classify non-African countries, tends to be very cautious and careful of that argument. They're pushed back easily, but I don't believe that necessarily holds true. There are alternatives to eating bushmeat. And when we say bushmeat, let's be clear. I come from a great ape conservation field, and millions of metric tons a year of bushmeat are harvested from African forests, but only a small percentage of that is great apes. Most of it is antelope, monkeys, other mammals, which doesn't lessen the impact. I'm just saying it's not necessarily chimpanzees moving off in millions. However, I do believe, though, that human beings don't have to continue the same destructive practices for centuries if it spells their doom. That's the definition of insanity if you hope for a different result. And I think we can be smart enough to provide alternative livelihoods, sustainability models. We can provide different forms of nutrition. We can do a million things that aren't as simple and as base as destroying habitat or killing great apes.
To what extent are species under threat around the world from what some people might call quack science or quack medicine? I'm thinking of shark fins, ivory from elephants ground up, and perhaps bushmeat, because you go to some markets in Africa and you'll find these parts of bushmeat being sold with some kind of medicinal value. So what impact is that having, and perhaps what impact could education have?
Well, there was a time when it was not uncommon to go into a hotel gift shop in Rwanda and you would find an ashtray being sold in the palm of a gorilla hand as a trophy. Those days are long gone, thankfully. I think we find less of the medicinal witch doctor mentality around great ape parts. It's far more for human consumption and eating, although there's a little bit of the medicinal aspect to it. What we're finding far more troubling with great apes now, though, is that the illegal trade in live great apes is going through the roof. It is far worse than we could ever have possibly imagined, driven or pulled, really, by the same Asian countries that are pushing the rhino horn and the ivory, largely China and Vietnam. To some lesser extent, the Middle East as well, but it's very fashionable to have a chimpanzee in your garden or a gorilla in your garden. And if someone's going to offer $40,000 for a gorilla on the streets of China, you can believe someone's going to poach one out of the forest.
What do you do with a gorilla in your garden?
When it's little, you look at it and you cuddle it. When it gets bigger, you have an issue. And it's the same with chimpanzees. This is an animal 5 times stronger than a human being. But when they're little, they're fuzzy and they're cute and they're furry, but when they become larger, they become an issue. And that's where you see a lot of them sold into bad zoos or moved into biomedical research or just abandoned sometimes. This is a terribly destructive practice because you can't go into a forest and just take a baby chimpanzee. You have to kill a whole family to get one live baby. And we are only confiscating a small fraction of the number moving out. Hundreds and hundreds are literally leaving the continent each year, going into Asia and the Middle East as pets, and it's become perhaps more destructive and certainly more of a financial driver than bushmeat is.
And that perhaps goes to the heart of the whole environmental issue, because you're competing against finance that you can't possibly match. Ivory, I suppose, and this too. So what's the answer?
When you talk about finance, it's actually organized crime. These are incredibly systematic operations that are extracting great apes from Africa and to a lesser extent Asia for financial gain. Quite often, when we do a confiscation, the same smuggler that has a live chimpanzee will also have ivory, animal pelts, drugs, launder money, guns. It's a very systematic, bundled process, and with very, very clear trade routes and incredibly sophisticated operations. The only answer to it really is more law enforcement, more crackdown, better education, harsher penalties. But right now, when at one point, for instance, in 2 years out of Guinea, 138 chimpanzees were extracted into China, going out on airplanes regularly, almost daily. They were being moved out, and no one stopped them. This kind of abuse of Africa, and as I say, Asia as well, really does have to stop.
Is it possible to reframe that issue in the locals' minds and almost drill it in that this is their heritage people are stealing? This is part of you. They are almost mocking by stealing these animals.
I think that actually has a huge role to play. There's a pride in all this, a natural heritage pride, and a sense of maintaining what is yours. Countries do get very upset when they realize that their heritage is being taken away from them. But I think also we've learned over the years that if you take a large species like a gorilla or an elephant or a rhino out of a forest or out of an ecosystem, it all begins to crumble. You can't take them out at the scale we're doing now without forests imploding upon themselves. And yet when you put them back, you find that forests actually recover quite quickly. So it's become quite clear that you can't have a table with 2 legs. It doesn't work. You have to have all the pieces in place. And I think that perhaps is a better sort of biodiversity argument, one that governments get on a much bigger scale rather than simply a smuggling issue or a medicinal issue or financial. And even a heritage issue sometimes doesn't quite resonate, as if you say, take these animals out, You lose the forest. Now what?
Couple more questions, and perhaps sort of straying slightly off topic, but I remember about a year ago there was a horrific incident when a woman who'd kept a chimpanzee, it sort of ripped half her face off. What can you use events like that to demonstrate to people, this is what happens when you mess with nature, this is what happens when you take a creature outside where it is supposed to live?
All of those incidents, as horrific as they are, usually work out in the favor of protection because they're so horrific that that particular event you described occurred in the United States. The U.S. suddenly began to implement laws about keeping chimpanzees and exotic pets. It was necessary. But it usually requires something as drastic as that. They make terrible pets. They make probably the worst pets on the face of the earth, especially chimpanzees. 5 times stronger than you are, equally as smart as you are, and equal with so much time on their hands to figure out what sort of trouble to get into. I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible combination. And I think most people who have them as a pet probably are a little lost in the head anyway. But it's available. They are available. Unfortunately, those kind of incidents really only work in probably developed countries. They don't really resonate across Africa or Asia in the same way for wild protection. Those are just very different issues. It's a very apples and oranges thing, but it all does go into the same pot.
Do you need to nip this in the bud at the supply or the demand end? I mean, it's, in a sense, it strikes me there are quite a few parallels with the sort of drug wars in Mexico at the moment. Is this a responsibility of the US authorities or further down in Latin America where they're actually producing these goods? What's your kind of view on, not the drug wars, but in terms of nipping it in the bud in supply or demand?
Well, I think you have to go from both ends, really. We've tried certainly the supply end, and that's not good enough. Because simply stopping poachers in Gabon, for instance, won't really make a difference if they continue to be offered such incredibly high amounts for delivery in China. You have to cut off the demand and the supply. It's not just the head, but the head and the tail have to be taken out of the equation. And I think that's important to remember. I think traditionally we have done law enforcement at the supply end, but that's just not good enough. You have to eliminate the financial market. You have to drop the value and make it unsustainable. And I think that's an important piece. I think also one of the things to remember when you referenced before the captive pet with the destructive tendencies, those chimpanzees, for instance, are born in captivity. They will always be in captivity. That's an American chimpanzee, for lack of a better word. It's a very different issue than trying to keep the ones in Congo in Congo.
In terms of protecting species, is that, I don't know, is it slightly self-defeating? Is it surely it's better to concentrate on areas and ensure areas are protected, and in a sense, once the areas are protected, then the species will look after themselves?
I think on paper that looks good, but if I tell someone to protect an area, they'll say, why? And I'll say, because that gorilla needs that area, and then they get it. It just makes the point more emphatic, and it personalizes the point. You feel a human connection with a great ape, or with an elephant, or with many other species. And I think, as I said before, that's one of the pieces coming back into this biodiversity and ecosystem management argument. We have to personalize it and give it a name and a face, because it's just too cold a topic to really get behind otherwise. And I think that's where great apes, and all species really, have a role to play. Even a poisonous dart frog can be cute to somebody. And if that makes them motivated enough to change the way they act, or to change a law, or to change a policy, then it did its job.
And I guess the final point, we have such a fascination with apes because I think, as you said earlier, they are our, I guess, nearest living relatives on the planet, and we have, epic films like Planet of the Apes or Sigourney Weaver's, Gorillas in the Mist. What kind of role does that kind of media play in, I don't know, shaping our views and attitudes towards apes?
I think all that media goes towards the same end result. I don't think any one film or any one researcher or any one documentary has really made the difference. All of them have a collective might behind them. Probably Gorillas in the Mist moved the bar up quicker just because it was a very popular film, and it really brought gorillas into your home in a way you hadn't thought of before. And she was a very iconic character, Diane Fossey. But I think still, all of that just builds awareness. It builds a sense that what is right and what is not. In my lifetime, it was very normal to go to a circus and see chimpanzees riding a bicycle. That is very hard to find nowadays. It's actually outlawed in many countries. Nowadays, in Spain, great apes have a personhood, legal standing, as a citizen, essentially, of Spain. That wasn't possible 25 years ago. So there's just this constant upward mobility of awareness and respect, I think, for great apes, brought on by great apes, really. And the media has a huge role to play in that.
Briefly, final question. Give me a timeline then, because the next 10 years could be crucial on any number of different levels. But what are we looking in the next 10 years? Could we see the extinction of one of these 4 great ape species? I mean, wild extinction at least, if not in zoos.
Well, you mentioned mountain gorillas, which were the stars of Gorillas in the Mist. There are 783 mountain gorillas in the world right now. That is not enough. That would barely fill one section of the stands at Old Trafford. It's a very small number. And all it would take is one flu outbreak, one Ebola outbreak, or one civil war to wipe them out. So there are populations that we can easily see disappear overnight. We could easily lose Sumatran orangutans. There's only about 5,000 of them left. Easily could go. As I said before, cross-river gorillas, 300. It would take nothing to push them off the map. So I think it's very possible that we could see that kind of a loss. But what a loss. It's catastrophic. And the knock-on effect of that would take a forest down with it, would take a regional economy down with it, and would certainly, I hope, be an alarm bell that we are losing at a dramatic rate that we may not recover from as people. We say, quite often in GRASP, our tagline is, "Their fate is ours." And it's true. If we can't save them, we can't save ourselves.